On one side, millions of dollars in campaign funding, Hollywood connections, and every camera in the country pointed in one direction. On the other side, a city council member, a few hundred volunteers going door to door, and almost zero national recognition. Now let me ask you something. Which one won? If you think the answer is obvious, I strongly urge you to stay until the very end of this video. Because Los Angeles delivered a lesson that night that will echo through American political history for decades. And nobody, not one single analyst, not one polling firm, not one media outlet, saw it coming. Los Angeles. The most expensive, most chaotic, most contradictory city on the face of the earth. A place where Hollywood glamour and homelessness crisis exist not just side by side, but sometimes on the same block. Where the distance between a Beverly Hills mansion and a Venice Beach tent city is only a few miles. But those few miles represent two entirely different realities. Two entirely different Americas. And by the time 2025 arrived, this city was in full crisis mode. The January wildfires, what would be recorded as one of the most catastrophic urban fire events in recorded American history, had torn through some of the city's most iconic neighborhoods. The Palisades, eaten, entire communities reduced to ash. Tens of thousands of residents displaced. Billions of dollars in property gone. And right in the middle of all of it, the person responsible for managing the city's response was somewhere else entirely. Karen Bass was in Ghana. Let that image sit for a moment. Because it sat with Los Angeles voters for months. When the hills were burning, when families were frantically loading cars with whatever they could carry, when fire departments were stretched to their absolute limits, the mayor of Los Angeles was on another continent. Bass had first been elected in 2022, and that election had its own dramatic arc. Billionaire real estate developer Rick Caruso had poured staggering sums into his campaign. Bass, running on a more traditional progressive platform with significantly less money, had won anyway. It was celebrated as a victory for grassroots politics over big money, a moment where the left held its ground. But the fires burned through that goodwill. The polling numbers tumbled. The coalition that had elected her started to fracture. And into that vacuum, that politically dangerous, emotionally raw, deeply uncertain vacuum, walked the most eclectic group of candidates Los Angeles had seen in years. The stage was set. The city was wounded. And now someone had to step forward and say, I can actually fix this. Every great political drama needs its cast. And this race had one that nobody could have scripted. First, Karen Bass, the incumbent. A former congresswoman with deep institutional ties and decades of experience in California politics. Defensive, yes. Bruised, certainly, but not out. She had survived political battles before. She knew how to absorb a hit and keep moving. Her base, while shaken, hadn't completely abandoned her, and underestimating Karen Bass had proven to be a mistake before. Then, and here's where it gets extraordinary, Spencer Pratt entered the race. Yes, that's Spencer Pratt. The reality television star. The man who turned the hills into appointment viewing through sheer force of manufactured drama. The man famous for his crystal collection, his social media antics, and his remarkable ability to generate controversy out of absolutely nothing. Spencer Pratt wanted to be the mayor of Los Angeles. When the announcement came, a lot of people assumed it was a stunt. A publicity play. A personal brand exercise dressed up as a political campaign. Some people laughed. Some people dismissed it immediately. A few people, and this is the part worth paying attention to, actually stopped and thought, wait, could this actually work? Because in the modern American political landscape, name recognition is a kind of currency, and Pratt had it in abundance. Millions of social media followers, instant media coverage, a built-in audience of people who already knew his name and found him entertaining. In an era when a reality TV star had already reached the highest office in the land, the Pratt candidacy didn't feel entirely impossible. And then, in the corner of the stage that most of the cameras weren't pointing at, stood Nithya Raman. If you heard the name Nithya Raman for the first time during this race, you were not alone. Most national political commentators either couldn't pronounce it correctly or simply didn't bother to investigate further. She was, in the language of mainstream American media, not the story, but in the neighborhoods of Silver Lake, Los Feliz, East Hollywood, and the densely populated apartment blocks of the 4th Council District, her name was very well known indeed. Raman had been elected to the Los Angeles City Council in 2020, and that election was its own quiet revolution. She had unseated a long-term incumbent in a race that most people hadn't been watching closely. Her campaign had been built not on big donor fundraisers or slick television ads, but on something far more labor-intensive: showing up, knocking on doors, listening, over and over and over again. Her political identity was rooted in the issues that most directly affected the city's working and middle-class residents: housing rights and tenant protections, tackling homelessness through systemic solutions, not just enforcement, climate preparedness as a structural challenge, not a talking point, investment in public transit, rent stabilisation. These were not the kind of issues that generated wall-to-wall cable news coverage, but they were the issues that determined whether a family could afford to stay in the city they'd lived in for 20 years. Raman was also Indian American, and in a city as demographically diverse as Los Angeles, a city where South Asian communities were growing in both size and political engagement, that identity carried real symbolic weight. She was a face that reflected the city's changing reality in a way that the political establishment had been slow to recognize. But none of that, on paper, translated automatically to a winning mayoral campaign. The question was, what was she actually going to do differently? This is the part of the story that deserves the most attention. Because what Nithya Raman did in this campaign was, by the standards of modern American politics, almost anachronistic, almost impossibly old-fashioned. And it worked. She built her campaign on people, not pollsters. Not media consultants charging 6 figures a month. Not high-dollar fundraising events at Malibu Estates. People, volunteers, hundreds of them. Then thousands spreading across the city every weekend and every weeknight, knocking on doors, making phone calls, having real conversations with real voters about real problems. This approach looks simple on paper. In practice, it is extraordinarily difficult. It requires an organizational infrastructure that takes months to build. It requires the kind of candidate who actually inspires that level of unpaid commitment, because you cannot pay people to care that much. And it requires a message that resonates not just in a 30-second ad, but in a one-on-one conversation at someone's front door. Raman had all three. Her message was this: Los Angeles is in crisis. The housing crisis is destroying the middle class. The climate crisis is making disasters like the January fires inevitable. The political establishment has been managing these problems, not solving them. And the people who are suffering the most, renters, working families, communities of color, deserve a mayor who actually understands the structural roots of what's happening to them. It wasn't a glamorous message. It didn't lend itself to viral moments or pithy sound bites, but it was a real message. And in a city still raw from watching its neighborhoods burn, realness had a power that polish simply couldn't match. You cannot understand this election without understanding what January 2025 did to Los Angeles on a psychological level. Not just the physical destruction, though that was catastrophic enough. The psychological damage, the erosion of trust. When a city burns, its residents look to their leaders. And what the residents of Los Angeles saw during those burning January nights was a mayor who was not there. Base returned quickly. She apologized. She threw herself into the response effort. But in politics, as in much of life, timing is everything. And the image of absence during the worst moment had already hardened into something that no amount of subsequent activity could fully dissolve. For Raman, the fires were not a political opportunity to be exploited. They were a confirmation of everything she had been saying about the structural failures in how Los Angeles was being governed. She connected the fires to climate policy, to land use decisions, to insurance crises, to the systemic underfunding of wildfire prevention infrastructure. This wasn't disaster tourism. This was a council member who had been working on these exact issues for years, suddenly finding that the worst possible version of the scenario she had been warning about had actually come to pass. Voters noticed. Not just the young, progressive voters who had always been sympathetic to her worldview, but older residents who had never voted for a candidate like Raman in their lives. Working-class homeowners who had lost everything and couldn't get their insurance claims processed. Retirees who watched 30 years of built equity disappear in a single night. They were angry. And anger, when it has a specific target and a credible alternative, is one of the most powerful forces in democratic politics. Raman was that credible alternative. Let's be precise about what happened to Spencer Pratt's campaign. Because the narrative of reality star runs for office, everyone laughs, he loses, is too simple. The actual story is more instructive. Pratt started the race with real assets. His name recognition was off the charts compared to most of the other candidates. His social media reach was enormous. His willingness to say provocative things generated constant media coverage. Early polling showed him with a non-trivial level of support, enough to take him seriously as a factor in the race, if not necessarily as a frontrunner. And his message, while light on specifics, tapped into a genuine vein of frustration. He positioned himself as an outsider, uncorrupted by the political establishment, willing to cut through bureaucratic dysfunction and do things differently. This is, as anyone paying attention to American politics over the past decade knows, a message with proven electoral power. But as the campaign progressed, the cracks became impossible to ignore. When asked detailed questions about housing policy, Pratt spoke in generalities. When pressed on budget specifics, he changed the subject. When confronted with the actual complexity of managing a city of 4 million people, with a multi-billion-dollar budget, a sprawling bureaucracy, a massive homeless population, and an infrastructure deficit measured in decades, he didn't have answers. He had vibes, and vibes, it turned out, were not enough for voters who had just watched their city burn. The name recognition that had seemed like an insurmountable advantage early in the race gradually revealed its limitation. Recognition is not the same as trust. People knew who Spencer Pratt was, but knowing who someone is and believing they can manage a crisis of the scale Los Angeles was facing are two very different things. The entertainment industry had given him a platform. Governance would require something else entirely. And by the final weeks of the campaign, even some of his early supporters were beginning to quietly recalibrate. In the weeks before Election Day, the polling landscape told what appeared to be a relatively coherent story. Bass was struggling but still ahead. Several challengers were nipping at her heels. Raman was present in the numbers but rarely identified as a primary threat to take the second spot in a runoff. The conventional wisdom among political analysts went something like this. The fires had weakened Bass significantly. There was a real possibility of a major upset, but the upset, if it came, would likely come from a more centrist direction, a candidate who could appeal to voters frustrated with progressive governance and looking for something more pragmatic. Raman didn't fit that narrative. She was unambiguously progressive. She supported strong tenant protections, significant investment in social housing, and an aggressive approach to climate policy. In a political environment where progressive overreach was supposedly the story, Raman was supposed to be vulnerable, not surging. This analysis missed something fundamental. The polling methodology that drives most American political forecasting is built for a certain kind of electorate. It captures people who answer phone surveys and engage with media in predictable ways. It is significantly less reliable when it comes to low-propensity voters who are deeply mobilized around a specific issue or candidate. It struggles to measure the kind of enthusiasm that translates into a volunteer knocking on a door at 7 p.m. on a Tuesday. Raman's campaign had generated exactly that kind of enthusiasm. And enthusiasm of that kind doesn't show up cleanly in a likely voter model. It shows up on Election Day, when people who hadn't voted in the last cycle suddenly show up at their polling place because someone came to their door 3 times and made them feel like their vote actually mattered. The polls weren't lying. They were just measuring the wrong thing. June 3, 2025, Election Day in Los Angeles. The city woke up hot and tense. Campaign offices buzzed with last-minute activity. Volunteers fanned out across the city to drive voters to polling places. Social media filled with predictions, counter-predictions, and the kind of anxious energy that precedes a moment that everyone senses might be significant. The first results came in after polls closed, and immediately the analysts on television started recalibrating. Karen Bass was performing roughly as expected, better in some areas, worse in others. The net picture was of an incumbent significantly weakened but not demolished. Spencer Pratt's numbers told a different story. In the districts where he had predicted strength, where name recognition should have translated to votes, the translation wasn't happening at the rate his campaign had projected. The gap between polling popularity and actual votes cast was measurable and growing, and Nithya Raman was running stronger than almost anyone had publicly forecast as the evening wore on and more precincts reported. The shape of the result became increasingly clear. Raman was not just performing well. She was consolidating in second place. She was going to be the candidate who faced Karen Bass in the runoff. Not a centrist challenger, not a wealthy outsider, not a TV personality with millions of followers. A city council member who had spent 5 years showing up for the people in her district and building, one conversation at a time. The kind of trust that money can approximate but never fully buy. The reactions were immediate and varied. In Raman's campaign headquarters, controlled jubilation. The kind of celebration that comes from people who knew what they had built and had dared to believe it might be enough. In Pratt's camp, the quiet particular to rooms where people are trying to process a result that contradicts everything they had allowed themselves to expect. In Bass's orbit, something more complicated. Relief that the opponent would be a fellow progressive rather than a well-funded centrist, combined with the sobering recognition that Raman's rise represented a genuine threat to her coalition. Spencer Pratt had been eliminated. And with him, a certain kind of political fairy tale, the one that says charisma plus platform plus name recognition equals political viability, had been tested and found insufficient. The raw election results, when examined carefully, told a story richer than any single headline could capture. Raman's geographic distribution of support was striking. She dominated in renter-heavy neighborhoods. She performed strongly in areas with high concentrations of working and middle-class households. She ran well in precincts with younger median voter ages. These were, in every case, the communities where her volunteers had spent the most time, where the door-knocking had been most intensive, where the message had been delivered most consistently and most personally. Pratt's support pattern was revealing in a different way. It was wide but thin, spread across many areas in small doses, never concentrated enough in any particular community to provide a durable base. This is a characteristic pattern for candidates whose support is driven primarily by name recognition rather than genuine affinity. People who recognize the name on the ballot and check the box, but who haven't been persuaded by a coherent vision or a sustained relationship with the campaign. Width without depth is very difficult to convert into electoral success in a competitive race. Base's erosion was most visible exactly where you would expect it, in the neighborhoods, most directly affected by the January fires. The communities where the image of absence had hit hardest, where the gap between what residents needed and what they felt they had received was widest. These were not communities that had necessarily shifted to Raman. Some of that erosion went to other candidates entirely, or manifested as reduced turnout from former Bass supporters who couldn't bring themselves to vote for the alternative but also couldn't bring themselves to vote for her. Either way, the effect was damaging. It would be a mistake to read Nithya Raman's success purely as a personal political achievement, because what she represents is bigger than one candidate in one city. For several years, a dominant narrative in American political commentary has been that progressive politics had overreached, that the left had miscalculated the public mood, that voters were turning away from ambitious structural reform in favor of something more cautious, more managerial, more centrist. This narrative was not entirely wrong. It captured real dynamics in certain elections in certain contexts. But Los Angeles was telling a different story. What Los Angeles voters seemed to be rejecting was not progressivism per se. What they were rejecting was progressivism as performance, as slogans and symbolic gestures disconnected from concrete, workable solutions to the problems that affected their daily lives. They were looking for progressivism as competence, progressivism as policy, progressivism that could look a renter in the eye and explain, specifically and credibly, how her rent was going to be stabilized. That could explain to a wildfire survivor exactly how the city's approach to climate-driven disaster risk was going to change. Raman offered that. And voters, when given the choice between the familiar comfort of a known brand and the harder-to-summarize credibility of someone who had actually done the work, chose credibility. There is also something important in the representational dimension of Raman's rise. Los Angeles is one of the most diverse cities in the world. Its political leadership, for much of its history, has not reflected that diversity fully or proportionally. An Indian American woman advancing to the final round of a mayoral race in this city is not a footnote. It is a signal about who gets to shape the political future of one of America's most consequential urban centers. With the primary decided, attention turned immediately to the runoff. and the dynamic of that runoff was genuinely complicated. Karen Bass had the advantages of incumbency, institutional infrastructure, existing city relationships, the ability to point to specific accomplishments even amid the crisis narrative. She was also, crucially, going into a runoff against a fellow progressive rather than a centrist challenger, which meant the ideological fault lines were more nuanced. Raman had momentum, organizational strength, and a clear message. But winning a runoff is a different challenge from winning a primary. The electorate expands. The dynamics shift, the scrutiny intensifies, and the resources required to run a citywide campaign at full intensity for additional months are considerable. What was clear was this: Los Angeles was not going to be a comfortable, predictable rematch. It was going to be a genuine contest of visions. Two candidates who both came from the left, but with different theories of change, different bases of support, and different relationships to the city's political establishment. For Bass, the central challenge was rebuilding trust, particularly with communities who had felt let down during the fire crisis. For Raman, the challenge was demonstrating that the organizing model that had worked so effectively in a primary could scale to a full citywide runoff. Neither challenge was insurmountable. Neither was guaranteed to be overcome. Step back from Los Angeles for a moment. Look at this story from the perspective of American democratic politics as a whole. What does it actually tell us? First, money matters, but it is not determinative. The candidate with the largest war chest does not automatically win. This is a truth that gets stated constantly and demonstrated regularly, but somehow never fully penetrates the conventional wisdom that campaigns are primarily resource competitions. Second, name recognition is not a substitute for credibility. Spencer Pratt had more name recognition than virtually anyone else in the race. He also had significantly less credibility on the issues that mattered most to voters who were thinking seriously about the governance challenges facing their city. The gap between those two things turned out to be decisive. Third, organizing works. Real organizing. The kind built on sustained human contact and genuine relationship building rather than algorithmic targeting and digital advertising. It is slower. It is harder. It is more labor-intensive. But when it is done well, it creates a kind of voter commitment that is qualitatively different from the passive recognition that a well-funded media campaign generates. Fourth, voters are capable of making sophisticated choices. The common view of the American electorate as easily manipulated by celebrity, money, and media narratives is, at minimum, incomplete. Given a real choice between substance and spectacle, a significant number of voters will choose substance. Not all voters, not in every context, but enough. Los Angeles learned something important on June 3, 2025. Spencer Pratt learned that politics is not television. Karen Bass learned, in the most painful possible way, that trust, once broken, is the hardest thing to rebuild in public life. And Nithya Raman proved something that every organizer who has ever knocked on a door at 7 p.m. in the rain already believed but rarely gets to see validated at this scale. That showing up, consistently and genuinely, is still the most powerful thing a political campaign can do. But one question lingers. One thread remains unresolved. Can Raman carry this momentum into the runoff? Can Bass rebuild the coalition that first elected her? And most importantly, what kind of Los Angeles will emerge from all of this? The answers are coming. But here is what I know right now. This city never behaves the way you expect it to. It never delivers the result the analysts predicted. It never rewards the candidate who thought they had it locked up. It rewards the candidate who refused to stop believing, even when the polls said not to, even when the money said not to, even when the entire media apparatus was pointing its cameras somewhere else. That is what makes Los Angeles, for all its chaos and contradiction and crisis, one of the most fascinating political laboratories in the world. And Nithya Raman's silent revolution may be only just beginning.